There is a version of the Vietnam War that most Americans learned. It came in the form of documentaries, textbooks, and memorial speeches. It arrived with a particular vocabulary, words like tragedy and quagmire and lesson learned, and it was framed almost universally as a war that was misunderstood. A war that good intentions walked into and could not walk out of. A war that America lost because the strategy was flawed, the enemy was underestimated, the public turned against it, the politicians lied. That framing has become so durable that it functions now almost like a consensus, and that consensus is the first thing that has to be set aside, because the more you study what actually happened, the more the word misunderstood starts to look like a kindness that the historical record does not support. The Vietnam War was not misunderstood by the people running it. It was misrepresented by them consistently, deliberately, and at every level of the chain of command, from the men writing field reports in the jungle, to the generals briefing the Secretary of Defense, to the President standing at a podium telling the country that progress was being made. The gap between what was known and what was said was not a gap born of confusion. It was a gap born of institutional necessity, and it was maintained with enormous energy for more than a decade. What follows are 25 stories from that war, not the stories that appeared in official summaries or congressional testimony. The stories that were classified, suppressed, quietly buried in filing cabinets, redacted into incomprehensibility, or simply never written down at all, because the men who witnessed them understood that writing them down would accomplish nothing good for anyone involved. Some of these stories were eventually declassified, some were reconstructed from interviews conducted decades after the fact. Some exist only in fragments, pieces of testimony that survived precisely because the people who gave them had already left the military and had nothing left to protect. Together, they form a picture of the war that is less dramatic than the one most people know and considerably more disturbing. The first story begins with numbers because the war began with numbers. Or more precisely, the war began with the realization that numbers were the only language the Pentagon was willing to speak. In 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara flew to South Vietnam for the first of what would become a series of visits. McNamara was a former Ford executive, a man who believed deeply in the power of quantitative analysis to reveal truth, to cut through ambiguity, and produce actionable conclusions. He walked into Vietnam with the intellectual confidence of someone who had reorganized a major corporation and believed that the same tools of measurement and assessment could be applied to a counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia. What he needed were metrics. What the military gave him were metrics. The problem, which would take years to become undeniable, was that the metrics being provided bore only an incidental relationship to the reality they were supposed to represent. The body count became the central metric of the war almost by accident. In the early years, when American units were just beginning to operate in the field alongside South Vietnamese forces, commanders needed some way to report progress to their superiors. Territory was difficult to use as a metric because the nature of guerrilla warfare meant that territory changed hands constantly and often meant nothing. Village pacification was too subjective, too dependent on local political conditions that American officers barely understood. But bodies were concrete. Bodies were countable. If you killed enemy combatants, you could report those deaths, and those deaths could be added up. And those totals could be compared across units and across time, and from those comparisons you could, in theory, construct a picture of whether the war was being won or lost. The ratio of enemy dead to American dead became, in the language of the Pentagon, the kill ratio, and the kill ratio became, functionally, the definition of success. What happened next was entirely predictable, and it was predicted by people whose predictions were ignored. When body count becomes the measure of success, and when careers and promotions and the continued funding of operations depend on demonstrating success, the body count will be inflated. This did not happen occasionally or in isolated units. It happened systematically, at every level of the command structure, in every branch of the military across the entire duration of the American combat presence in Vietnam. The inflation took many forms. Civilians killed in airstrikes or artillery bombardments were counted as enemy combatants. Men killed in disputed circumstances were listed as enemy soldiers without investigation. Multiple reports of the same engagement, filed by different units, produced duplicate counts that were never reconciled. In some cases, commanders simply instructed their men to report higher numbers. In other cases, the pressure was more subtle. A raised eyebrow when a unit came back with low counts, a pattern of rewards for units that consistently reported high ones. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated American officers of the war, estimated in interviews conducted after his retirement that a significant portion of the body counts he witnessed were fabricated or inflated. He described the process as almost automatic, a reflex that had been built into the institutional culture of the military so thoroughly that officers did it without being ordered to and sometimes without being fully conscious that they were doing it. He described units in which every enemy contact, regardless of outcome, was reported as a kill. He described situations in which Vietnamese civilians were shot, and then weapons were placed beside their bodies to justify counting them as combatants. He was not the only officer to describe these practices. He was simply one of the few willing to say so publicly. The second story is about a place called Tiger Force. Tiger Force was a small elite unit of the 101st Airborne Division that operated in the Central Highlands and the coastal lowlands of South Vietnam from 1967 onward. It was designed as a rapid response force, a small group of highly aggressive soldiers who could move quickly through dense terrain and engage enemy units before they could disperse. In the beginning, by most accounts, it operated more or less within the rules of engagement that governed American forces in the field. By 1967, it had become something else entirely. What Tiger Force did in the villages of Quang Ngai and Quang Tin provinces during the summer and fall of 1967 was investigated by the Army Criminal Investigation Command beginning in 1971. The investigation lasted 4.5 years. It produced evidence of the murder of hundreds of civilians, including women, children, and elderly villagers. It documented the mutilation of bodies, the cutting of ears as trophies, the killing of detainees, and the destruction of villages without military justification. At the conclusion of the investigation, the Army declined to prosecute any of the soldiers involved. The investigation was classified. It remained classified for more than 30 years. The Toledo Blade, a newspaper in Ohio, broke the story in 2003 after its reporters spent 18 months tracking down former Tiger Force soldiers and obtaining documents through the Freedom of Information Act. The reporters spoke with former members of the unit who described what had happened in considerable detail, men who had spent decades living with what they had done and what they had seen others do. Some of them had reported the atrocities through official channels at the time. Their reports had been received, acknowledged, and ultimately suppressed. One former soldier described reporting a killing to his commanding officer and being told that he had not seen what he thought he had seen. Another described filing a formal complaint that disappeared entirely from the records, a complaint that he had documentation of submitting and that the Army had no record of receiving. The third story is connected to the second because the suppression of Tiger Force was not an isolated act of institutional self-protection. It was part of a pattern that extended across the war and reached into its highest levels. In 1969, a young soldier named Ron Ridenour sent letters to Congress, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House describing a massacre that had occurred in a village called My Lai in March of 1968. Ridenour had not been present at My Lai. He had heard about it from other soldiers, and he had spent months quietly gathering accounts, building a picture of what had happened before deciding to report it. His letters sat in various offices for weeks before anyone acted on them. The Army eventually opened an investigation, and that investigation led to the court-martial of Lieutenant William Calley, who was convicted of murdering 22 civilians. Calley served 3.5 years of house arrest before being released. He was the only person convicted in connection with the massacre of somewhere between 300 and 500 Vietnamese civilians. What the subsequent decades of investigation revealed was that My Lai was not an aberration that surprised the chain of command. It was an event that the chain of command had actively worked to conceal. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, who had landed his aircraft between American soldiers and fleeing Vietnamese civilians during the massacre and ordered his crew to protect them, filed reports about what he had witnessed that same day. Those reports were rewritten by the time they reached brigade headquarters, transformed from accounts of civilian killings into accounts of a successful engagement against enemy combatants. Thompson was not thanked for his actions. He was investigated. He was harassed. He received death threats from fellow soldiers. He spent nearly 30 years waiting for the army to acknowledge what he had done before he was finally awarded the Soldier's Medal in 1998. The men who had committed the massacre received no comparable recognition from the army. Many of them went on to complete their service without disciplinary action of any kind. The fourth story is about the Phoenix program, which was one of the most extensive and least understood operations of the entire war. Phoenix was a joint CIA and South Vietnamese operation designed to dismantle the Viet Cong infrastructure. The network of political organizers, tax collectors, intelligence agents, and local administrators who gave the communist movement its organizational coherence in South Vietnamese villages. The theory behind Phoenix was sound, at least on paper. Guerrilla movements survive because of their roots in the civilian population, and if you can identify and neutralize the people who maintain those roots, you can hollow out the movement without fighting it militarily. The practice of Phoenix became something considerably more complicated. At its operational core, Phoenix relied on informants, local South Vietnamese who identified members of the Viet Cong infrastructure to provincial reconnaissance units, which were then supposed to capture, interrogate, and either imprison or turn those individuals. The program had quotas. Provincial officials were expected to neutralize a certain number of Viet Cong infrastructure members per month, and those quotas were used to evaluate their performance. The predictable consequence was that the definition of Viet Cong infrastructure expanded to meet the quotas. Personal enemies were denounced. Land disputes were resolved by accusation. People with no connection to the communist movement were arrested, tortured, and in significant numbers killed in order to produce numbers that satisfied the program's administrators. The CIA officer who ran Phoenix at its peak, William Colby, later testified before Congress that approximately 20,000 people had been killed under the program. Other estimates ran considerably higher. The South Vietnamese government's own records suggested the number was closer to 40,000, though the reliability of those records was itself uncertain. The interrogation methods used on Phoenix detainees were documented in reports that circulated within the CIA and military intelligence apparatus throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s. Those reports described waterboarding, electric shock, the use of animals, prolonged sleep deprivation, and techniques that produced confessions which were operationally useless because the people giving them would say anything to make the pain stop. Intelligence analysts who worked with Phoenix-derived information described it as largely unreliable, contaminated by the conditions under which it was obtained. They filed assessments to that effect. Those assessments influenced almost nothing. The fifth story concerns the air war, specifically the air war over Laos and Cambodia, which was conducted simultaneously with the ground war in Vietnam and which, for years, the United States government officially denied was happening. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of roads and paths along which North Vietnam supplied its forces in the south, ran not through North Vietnam itself, but primarily through Laos and Cambodia, countries that were officially neutral and whose neutrality the United States was treaty-bound to respect. The practical military problem this created was considered unsolvable by conventional diplomatic means. The solution adopted was to conduct the bombing campaign anyway and simply not tell anyone about it. Operation Menu, which began in 1969 under President Nixon and was directed by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, involved systematic bombing of Cambodian territory along the South Vietnamese border. The existence of the operation was kept secret not only from Congress and the American public, but from most of the senior military and civilian leadership of the Defense Department. A separate set of falsified records was maintained to conceal the true targets of B-52 strikes. When aircraft reported bombing in Cambodia, those reports were altered to show targets inside South Vietnam. Officers who knew about the falsification and objected were reassigned. The bombing of Cambodia continued for 14 months before it became public, and even after it became public, the full extent of it was not disclosed. The tonnage of bombs dropped on Laos during the war is still not fully accounted for, but estimates based on declassified military records suggest that Laos received more bombs per capita than any other country in history. The bombing had limited effect on the movement of supplies along the trail. The North Vietnamese adapted their logistics with a flexibility and resilience that American air planners consistently underestimated, dispersing supplies, moving at night, rebuilding roads within days of their destruction. The bombs that missed the trail killed Laotian and Cambodian civilians in numbers that have never been precisely established because no one in the American military was tracking those deaths in any systematic way. Unexploded ordnance from those campaigns continues to kill and maim people in Laos today, at a rate that the Lao government estimates at several hundred per year. The sixth story begins in the Mekong Delta in 1968 and concerns a Navy operation called SEAL Team activities in what was then designated the Rung Sat Special Zone. SEAL teams operating in the Delta conducted nighttime missions that were described in their official reporting as reconnaissance and direct action against Viet Cong units. Former members of those teams, speaking in interviews conducted decades after the war, described a different operational reality, one in which the lines between targeted killing of combatants and assassination of suspected civilian collaborators had become, in the field, effectively non-existent. They described missions in which the targets were identified by South Vietnamese intelligence officers whose motivations and reliability were unknown, in which no independent verification of target identity was possible, and in which the consequences of reporting a target as a non-combatant were operationally and professionally inconvenient. Several former SEALs described returning from missions uncertain whether they had killed enemy soldiers or village officials who had made political enemies in the wrong places. The seventh story is about fragging, which became one of the most discussed and least honestly examined phenomena of the war. Fragging refers to the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own men, typically using fragmentation grenades, which gave the practice its name. The Pentagon's official statistics on fragging are incomplete by the Pentagon's own acknowledgement, because many fragging incidents were reported as accidents or enemy action. The numbers that are in the record show a significant increase in fragging incidents beginning around 1969 and continuing through the withdrawal of American combat forces in 1973. The Army counted at least 900 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents during the war, with 99 officers and non-coms killed. Independent analyses based on hospital records, criminal investigation reports, and interview data suggest the actual number was considerably higher. Fragging was a symptom of a collapse in command authority that the military did not fully acknowledge while it was happening. By 1969, large portions of the American ground force in Vietnam were composed of draftees who did not want to be there, who did not believe in the war, who had watched their friends die in engagements whose strategic purpose they could not discern, and who had concluded that the officers ordering them into combat were either indifferent to their survival or actively pursuing career advancement at their expense. The calculation that a soldier faced when ordered into a combat operation he considered suicidal or pointless had changed from previous wars. In World War II, the institutional culture of the military, the moral clarity of the cause, the social pressure of shared belief had made defiance almost unthinkable. In Vietnam by 1969, for a significant portion of the force, those constraints had eroded. What replaced them was a cold assessment of individual survival, and some men concluded that their survival was better served by eliminating the officer giving the order than by following it. The Army's response to fragging was largely institutional suppression. Criminal investigations were opened and then closed without charges. Cases were classified. Officers who survived fragging attempts were sometimes quietly transferred rather than given the opportunity to identify and testify against their attackers. The Army did not want to acknowledge the scale of the problem, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging that the American military in Vietnam had partially lost the ability to command the obedience of its own soldiers. The eighth story concerns the widespread use of drugs within the American military in Vietnam, which was extensively documented and extensively ignored. By 1971, Army surveys were showing that a substantial portion of enlisted men in Vietnam had used marijuana, and that a significant percentage had used heroin. Heroin was available in Vietnam at extraordinary purity levels and at prices that made it accessible even to soldiers of the lowest pay grades. The supply chain for heroin in Vietnam ran, in part, through elements of the South Vietnamese military and civilian government that the United States was simultaneously funding, arming, and treating as allies in the effort to build a stable, non-communist state. The CIA was aware of the involvement of certain South Vietnamese officials and military officers in the heroin trade. The decision was made, at levels the documentary record does not precisely identify, that disrupting the heroin supply chain was less important than maintaining the political relationships that the supply chain ran through. The consequences of this decision for the American military were severe and immediate. Heroin addiction among American soldiers created operational problems that commanders were required to address in their field reports. Many of those reports used euphemisms that obscured the nature of the problem. Addicted soldiers were described as unfit for duty without specifying why. Medical evacuations for drug-related causes were classified under other diagnostic categories. A military assistance command study from 1971 that estimated the scope of heroin use in Vietnam was classified immediately upon completion and was not declassified for more than 2 decades. The ninth story is about what happened to soldiers who came home, not the political controversy about their reception, which has been extensively documented, but the institutional response to what they carried back with them. The clinical syndrome that would eventually be named post-traumatic stress disorder did not officially exist in 1973. The American Psychiatric Association did not add it to its diagnostic manual until 1980, after sustained lobbying by Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who were treating them. Before 1980, veterans presenting with nightmares, hypervigilance, intrusive memories, emotional numbness, and inability to maintain relationships were given various other diagnoses, many of which carried implications of pre-existing mental weakness or character deficiency rather than trauma response. They were told in various ways that their problems were their own and that the war was not responsible for producing them. The Veterans Administration, which was responsible for providing mental health care to returning veterans, was systematically underfunded throughout the 1970s and consistently resistant to recognizing the scale of psychological injury the war had produced. VA administrators appeared before Congress to argue that the mental health problems of Vietnam veterans were not significantly different from those of veterans of previous wars and did not require specialized programs or additional resources. This position was maintained for years despite accumulating clinical evidence to the contrary, evidence that was being generated not by the VA but by small, underfunded outreach programs that veterans had organized themselves, working with clinicians willing to see them outside the institutional system. The 10th story concerns a program called Operation Speedy Express, which was conducted by the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta from December 1968 through May 1969. The 9th Division, under Major General Julian Ewell, pursued the war with an emphasis on body count that was extreme even by the standards of Vietnam. Ewell placed extraordinary pressure on subordinate commanders to produce kills, and the kill statistics that the 9th Division reported during Speedy Express were extraordinary. The division claimed 11,000 enemy killed during the operation, with a weapons seizure rate that amounted to roughly 1 weapon recovered for every 6 enemy deaths claimed. The weapons seizure rate was the tell. Military analysts understood that in a genuine military engagement, enemy soldiers carry weapons, and those weapons are either recovered or accounted for. A ratio of 1 weapon per 6 deaths suggests that a large portion of the reported kills were not armed combatants. After the war, a Newsweek investigation and a series of internal army reviews concluded that a substantial portion of the deaths attributed to Operation Speedy Express were civilian deaths, that Vietnamese farmers and villagers had been killed in large numbers and counted as enemy combatants in order to produce the body counts that Ewell's operational framework demanded. The Internal Army Review, produced in 1971, reached conclusions that its authors described as deeply troubling. The review was classified. Ewell was promoted. The 11th story is about the interrogation facility at Con Son Island, which was the primary prison facility for South Vietnamese political prisoners. Con Son was not an American facility in the strict sense. It was operated by the South Vietnamese government, but the United States built it, funded it, supplied it, and maintained a continuous American advisory presence within it. The facility became internationally known in 1970 when a congressional delegation visiting Vietnam made an unannounced visit to Con Son and discovered the tiger cages, underground concrete cells so small that prisoners could not stand upright, in which political prisoners were kept for months and years, many of them chained to the floor, many showing signs of severe physical abuse. The congressional delegation's report was one of the more disturbing documents to emerge from the war, describing conditions that the delegation's members, most of whom had supported the war and the South Vietnamese government, found indefensible. The American response to the tiger cage revelations was carefully managed. The State Department expressed concern through diplomatic channels. The South Vietnamese government made promises of reform. The tiger cages were modified, and new prisoners continued to be held in similar conditions. American funding to the South Vietnamese prison system continued. The advisory presence at Con Son continued. The internal State Department cables documenting American knowledge of conditions at Con Son and the decision to continue funding regardless were classified and remained classified for years after the war ended. The 12th story concerns the Green Berets and a killing that became, briefly, a public scandal. In 1969, members of the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam killed a Vietnamese man named Thai Quoc Nguyen, who was suspected of being a double agent working for North Vietnamese intelligence. The killing was ordered through a chain of command that included the commanding officer of the 5th Special Forces Group, Colonel Robert Rote. The body was weighted and dropped into the South China Sea. When the killing came to light through an informant, 8 Special Forces officers were arrested and charged with premeditated murder. The case became a major story in the American press. The charges were eventually dropped by the Secretary of the Army, Stanley Resor, citing the CIA's refusal to allow its personnel to testify about the operation. Resor's stated rationale was that a fair trial was impossible without CIA testimony. The unstated rationale, which several of the officers involved later described, was that a trial would have required public discussion of how the Special Forces and the CIA were conducting the war in ways that were not consistent with the rules the American public believed were governing American conduct. The 13th story is about a phenomenon that soldiers and some historians refer to as the war within the war, which was the conflict between American units and the South Vietnamese military forces they were ostensibly allied with and advising. This conflict was rarely violent, though it occasionally became so. More often it was a grinding, demoralizing experience of institutional dysfunction that American advisors described in private letters and personal accounts with a consistency and bitterness that almost never made its way into official reports. American advisors embedded with South Vietnamese units described officers who were appointed through political connections rather than military competence, who would not order their men into combat for reasons that were never explained, who reported engagements that had not occurred and casualties that had not been sustained. They described units that melted away when they encountered serious resistance, that fired their weapons into the air to make noise rather than into enemy positions, that collaborated openly with the local Viet Cong infrastructure in arrangements that preserved both sides from the costs of actual fighting. These observations were reported through advisory channels and were received by the Military Assistance Command with varying degrees of seriousness. The political sensitivity of acknowledging the weakness of the South Vietnamese military made honest assessment institutionally difficult. A judgment that the South Vietnamese army was fundamentally incapable of carrying the war was a judgment that called into question the entire strategic rationale for the American commitment. So the assessments that circulated within the command tended toward qualified optimism, toward descriptions of problems that were being addressed and capabilities that were being developed, rather than the harder conclusions that the evidence supported. The 14th story concerns the use of chemical agents during the war, specifically the defoliation program known as Operation Ranch Hand and the herbicide called Agent Orange. The military rationale for herbicide use was straightforward. Vegetation provided cover for enemy movement, and removing the vegetation would expose enemy units to observation and air attack. The herbicides used, primarily Agent Orange, were mixtures of two chemicals that were contaminated in the manufacturing process with a compound called dioxin, which is among the most toxic substances produced by industrial processes. The health effects of dioxin exposure were not fully understood at the time of the program's initiation, but evidence of toxicity began accumulating almost immediately, both in animal studies conducted by the manufacturers and in epidemiological data from communities near herbicide production facilities. The manufacturers of Agent Orange provided their federal government customers with early data suggesting health risks. The Department of Defense received internal assessments from its own scientific advisors, raising concerns about the safety of the program. These assessments did not stop the program, which continued at large scale from 1962 through 1971 and resulted in the spraying of approximately 20 million gallons of herbicide over South Vietnamese territory. American soldiers on the ground walked through areas that had been sprayed and worked with the herbicide directly, without protective equipment, often without being told what it was. The South Vietnamese rural population was exposed to it in ways that were even less controlled and even less documented. The health consequences for American veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange became one of the most protracted bureaucratic struggles of the post-war period. The Veterans Administration resisted connecting veterans' illnesses to Agent Orange exposure for decades, conducting and then disputing studies, setting evidentiary standards that veterans advocates described as designed to produce denial rather than assessment. The struggle to establish service connection for Agent Orange-related diseases consumed the adult lives of tens of thousands of veterans and the organizational energies of veterans groups for the better part of 30 years. The Vietnamese casualties from Agent Orange exposure have never been systematically assessed by any international health authority. The 15th story is about the intelligence community's assessment of the war's trajectory, which diverged increasingly from the public assessments being given to Congress and the American people beginning in approximately 1965. Within the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, analysts were producing reports that were substantially more pessimistic than anything the Johnson or Nixon administrations were willing to present publicly. These reports questioned the significance of body count metrics, noted the resilience of North Vietnamese logistics despite sustained bombing, assessed the political fragility of successive South Vietnamese governments, and in some cases reached explicit conclusions that the war as currently being conducted was not winnable within any reasonable time frame or acceptable cost. These assessments were received, read, filed, and in several cases actively suppressed. When CIA Director Richard Helms presented an assessment to the Johnson White House in 1967 that the strategic bombing of North Vietnam was not producing the results being claimed for it, the report was received with hostility. When Sam Adams, a CIA analyst, produced an assessment in 1967 suggesting that the enemy order of battle, the actual number of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in the south, was approximately double the figure being used in official estimates, the assessment was suppressed, and the official estimate was maintained. The suppression of Adams's order of battle assessment was significant because the official estimate was used to show that the war was being won. If the actual enemy strength was twice what was being reported, then the kill ratios and body counts that demonstrated progress were demonstrating nothing. Adams spent years trying to get his assessment into the official record. He eventually left the CIA and testified about the suppression before a congressional committee. He died before the matter was fully resolved. The 16th story is about what happened in the A Shau Valley in 1969. Specifically around an action that became known publicly as Hamburger Hill. The battle was real, and it was covered by the press in considerable detail. What was less covered was the conversation that took place within the military command about what it meant. American forces, primarily the 101st Airborne Division, assaulted a heavily fortified North Vietnamese position on a hill designated 937 over the course of 10 days in May 1969, suffering significant casualties, taking the hill, and then abandoning it approximately a week after its capture. The military rationale offered for the assault, that the hill needed to be taken to disrupt North Vietnamese logistics in the valley, was immediately questioned by members of Congress and by military analysts who noted that the hill had no particular strategic value and that the North Vietnamese returned to it within weeks of the American withdrawal. The internal discussion about Hamburger Hill within the military revealed a command structure that had difficulty articulating its own strategic logic. The public rationale was attrition, that the point was to kill as many North Vietnamese as possible, regardless of terrain objectives, and that the battle had been successful by this measure. The private assessments were less confident. Some officers who were directly involved in the planning and execution of the assault described it in later interviews as an example of military action undertaken to demonstrate that an operation was underway, to show movement and activity in a theater where the broader strategic situation was static. The action produced casualties and statistics. It produced nothing durable in the valley. The 17th story is about the Americal Division, which was the division responsible for the area of operations that included My Lai, and about the pattern of violence in Quang Ngai province that My Lai represented. The Army's own investigation of My Lai, the Peers Commission, was more thorough than most, and reached harder conclusions than most official inquiries produced during the war. But even the Peers Commission operated within the constraint that it was investigating a specific incident rather than a systemic pattern. The testimony it collected and the research conducted by historians who subsequently examined the same ground suggested that violence against civilians in Quang Ngai province was not confined to March 16, 1968. It described a pattern of operations in which civilian casualties were routine, in which the rules of engagement were interpreted to allow the killing of virtually anyone in certain designated areas, and in which command pressure for high body counts created conditions that made restraint operationally irrational. The Quaker Service Committee, which operated a medical program in Quang Ngai during the war, produced reports documenting civilian casualties in the province that were submitted to the American Embassy and the Military Assistance Command. Those reports described patterns of injury that were inconsistent with combat between military forces, patterns suggesting that civilians were being killed in their homes, in their fields, in circumstances that did not resemble military engagements. The embassy and the command received those reports and did not act on them. The reports were filed, and the program that produced them continued to operate and continued to generate evidence of patterns that the military did not investigate. The 18th story concerns the experience of African American soldiers in Vietnam in ways that went beyond the well-documented statistical disparity in their assignment to combat roles. By the late 1960s, the racial tensions that were reshaping American society were present in Vietnam as well, and they were present in forms that the military's official accounts consistently understated. There were race riots on military bases in rear areas. In Long Binh Jail, the military detention facility in South Vietnam, known to soldiers as LBJ. The Long Binh riot of 1968 resulted in significant injuries and one death, and required intervention by military police and officers to suppress. Subsequent investigations acknowledged that conditions in Long Binh Jail were contributing factors to the riot, that black soldiers were being held there in disproportionate numbers and under conditions that had produced a level of anger that required only a specific incident to erupt. African American soldiers in Vietnam formed their own organizational networks, exchanged what they called DAP handshakes, that white soldiers and officers sometimes described as threatening, wore black power symbols that generated formal disciplinary responses in some units and informal tension in all of them. Several black officers who served in Vietnam described in oral history interviews conducted decades later the experience of commanding units in which white enlisted men were openly reluctant to accept their authority, and in which the command structure above them was often indifferent or hostile to their complaints about this. The official record of racial conflict in Vietnam is partial, because the institutional incentives for reporting it accurately were limited, and the incentives for suppressing or minimizing it were considerable. The 19th story is about the treatment of prisoners of war by American forces, which existed alongside and distinct from the treatment of American prisoners by North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese treatment of American prisoners was extensively documented, was used extensively in American domestic politics, and remains one of the most discussed aspects of the war. The treatment of prisoners by American forces and their South Vietnamese allies received considerably less attention and generated considerably less political energy, despite the fact that documentary evidence of mistreatment was available throughout the war and was periodically presented to official bodies that responded with varying degrees of action. American military law and the Geneva Conventions established clear rules for the treatment of prisoners. The reality of prisoner handling in Vietnam was more complicated than the rules suggested. Prisoners were taken under combat conditions in which the pressures of battle, the proximity of ongoing fighting, and the absence of adequate holding facilities created situations that the rules had not fully anticipated. Some prisoners were executed in the field, a practice that individual officers condoned or ignored under the theory that taking and holding prisoners was operationally impractical. Others were handed over to South Vietnamese forces, whose interrogation methods were known to include torture and who were not subject to American military law. The handover of prisoners to South Vietnamese custody was, in a number of documented cases, a procedural mechanism for circumventing American rules that would have prevented certain interrogation techniques from being applied by American soldiers directly. Reports documenting the mistreatment of prisoners that were submitted through official channels were received with varying responses. Some generated investigations, others were filed without action. In a few cases, officers who reported mistreatment they had witnessed were quietly advised that filing such reports was not in their interest. The pattern of advice was consistent enough that it had predictable effects on reporting rates. The 20th story is about a classified study called the Vietnam Study Task Force, more commonly known as the Pentagon Papers, which was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967. McNamara had concluded by that point that the war was being lost and wanted a comprehensive historical record of how the United States had arrived at its current situation. The study was produced by analysts within the Defense Department and ran to approximately 7,000 pages. It was classified at the highest levels. It documented, in systematic detail, the pattern of deception that had characterized American policy in Vietnam from the Truman administration onward, the systematic gap between what officials said publicly and what they believed privately, the consistent pattern of optimistic public statements issued in the face of private pessimism, the deliberate decisions to escalate the war without honest public disclosure of the strategic logic or anticipated costs. When Daniel Ellsberg, one of the analysts who worked on the study, leaked it to the New York Times in 1971, the Nixon administration's response was to seek an injunction preventing publication, the first prior restraint on a major American publication in the country's history. The Supreme Court ruled against the injunction. The Pentagon Papers were published. They changed the public's understanding of the war in ways that were significant and ways that were insufficient. They revealed the deception clearly enough. What they could not fully convey was the texture of that deception, the extent to which it had become institutional reflex rather than calculated conspiracy. The degree to which the people perpetuating it had, in many cases, persuaded themselves that it was not deception at all. The 21st story is about the final years of direct American combat involvement from 1969 through 1973, during which the Nixon administration pursued a policy called Vietnamization, which was the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while American troops were withdrawn. The theory was that the South Vietnamese military, properly trained and equipped, could continue the war without American ground forces. The evidence available to the people planning the policy suggested that this was not likely to be true. The assessments coming from American advisors embedded with South Vietnamese units described an army that was not developing the institutional capacity that Vietnamization required. Those assessments competed with political necessity and lost. The withdrawal proceeded according to a schedule driven by American domestic politics, and the question of whether the South Vietnamese military could actually sustain the war without American ground forces was answered definitively in April 1975. During the Vietnamization period, American casualties continued at a rate that was considered, in the political context of the time, acceptable. The soldiers dying in 1970 and 1971 were dying in a war that their own government had privately concluded was not going to end in the outcome the government was still publicly claiming to pursue. The gap between what was known and what was said had, by this point, become so wide that it was almost structural, a feature of the institutional landscape rather than a series of individual decisions. Officers who filed honest reports about the military situation faced the same informal pressures that had operated throughout the war. The incentives for accuracy had not improved. The 22nd story is about a series of after-action reports filed by units operating along the Cambodian border in 1970, following the incursion that Nixon ordered in the spring of that year. The Cambodian incursion was sold publicly as a decisive operation to destroy the Central Office for South Vietnam, the headquarters from which North Vietnam supposedly directed the war in the south. American forces entered Cambodia, fought, took casualties, and found base areas and supply caches that were real and that were significantly smaller than had been claimed in the pre-operation briefings. The Central Office for South Vietnam was not found in anything resembling a fixed headquarters. The North Vietnamese command structure, as American intelligence had in fact assessed privately before the operation, was dispersed and mobile in ways that made it immune to the kind of decisive strike the operation was designed to deliver. The after-action reports that circulated within the command structure reflected this honestly. The public statements made about the operation's results did not. The 23rd story is about what soldiers called the rear, the administrative and logistical areas behind the front lines, where most of the military's support personnel were based. The rear in Vietnam was not a safe place in the conventional sense, but it was considerably less dangerous than the forward operating areas where the infantry was based, and it was a place where the gap between the war as experienced and the war as administered was most visible. Soldiers who moved between the field and the rear described the experience as moving between two different institutional realities. In the rear, the paperwork of the war continued, the reports, the requisitions, the evaluations, the planning documents, the career management that was the military's peacetime metabolism, continuing alongside the actual fighting. Officers in the rear were managing careers in ways that officers in the field found, by the later years of the war, somewhere between incomprehensible and obscene. The practice of ticket punching, in which officers served short rotations in command positions specifically to acquire the career credentials that combat command provided, without the sustained investment in their units that effective command required, was extensively documented in the private accounts of soldiers and lower-ranking officers. It produced a specific kind of institutional damage. Units with commanders who were present for 6 months and then rotated out, replaced by other commanders who were equally temporary, lost the institutional continuity that organizational effectiveness required. Decisions that should have reflected accumulated knowledge of terrain, enemy patterns, and unit capabilities were instead made by officers who were still learning when they were already scheduled to leave. The 24th story concerns the Vietnamese civilians who lived in contested areas throughout the war and whose experience of the conflict has been the least systematically documented aspect of it. The American military categorized the population of South Vietnam in ways that served military purposes: friendly civilians, hostile civilians, Viet Cong sympathizers, neutrals. These categories were operational tools rather than descriptions of a reality that was considerably more complicated. Vietnamese villagers living in contested areas dealt with the Viet Cong because the Viet Cong were present and had the capacity to harm them if they did not, and with South Vietnamese government forces and American units for the same reason. Their behavior was a rational adaptation to a situation in which multiple armed parties with incompatible demands were making incompatible claims on their loyalty and their resources. The American military's attempts to assess and quantify this population to determine through Hamlet evaluation systems and population attitude surveys who was loyal and who was not were efforts to impose a binary framework on a situation that was not binary. The relocation programs that moved rural Vietnamese into government-controlled areas, called strategic hamlets under Kennedy and by various other names under subsequent administrations, were designed in theory to separate the population from the guerrilla movement. In practice, they displaced people from land they had farmed for generations, disrupted the agricultural economy of entire regions, and generated resentment that the communist movement was able to exploit politically. The assessments of these programs that circulated within the American advisory structure were mixed and often honest. The decisions made about the programs were not consistently driven by those assessments. The 25th story is not a single event or a specific program, but a description of what the war had become by 1972, in its final years of significant American involvement. By 1972, the number of American ground troops in Vietnam had dropped dramatically from its peak, and the character of the remaining American presence had changed. The soldiers who were still in Vietnam in 1972 were, in large proportions, men who were aware that the war was ending, that the strategic situation was not what had been claimed, that the sacrifices being asked of them served purposes that their own government could not clearly articulate. The unit cohesion problems, the drug use, the fragging, the collective forms of non-compliance that had been present since the late 1960s had not diminished. In some formations, they had intensified. The army was managing a significant morale crisis while simultaneously conducting an active war. The peace negotiations that led to the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were conducted against this backdrop. The agreement that emerged left North Vietnamese forces in place in the south. A fact that American negotiators understood meant the eventual resumption of large-scale fighting. The South Vietnamese government, which had been excluded from significant portions of the negotiations, understood this too. The Nixon administration's assurances to South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that the United States would respond with air power if North Vietnam violated the agreement were given and received as political commitments that both parties understood might not be honored, given the state of American domestic politics. The agreement was signed. The American military withdrew. The promised air support never materialized when North Vietnam resumed its offensive in 1975 because Congress had prohibited it. The South Vietnamese government collapsed in 75 days. The last American combat deaths in Vietnam occurred on April 29, 1975, when two Marines, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge, were killed in a rocket attack at Tan Son Nhut Air Base while helping to provide security for the evacuation of American personnel. They were among the last American troops in the country. The evacuation continued around them. The helicopters took off from the embassy roof and from Tan Son Nhut and from other points around Saigon, carrying American personnel, carrying some Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans and were correctly afraid of what would happen to them when the North Vietnamese arrived, leaving behind many more who could not get to the landing zones in time. The last American helicopter left Saigon in the early morning hours of April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks entered the city later that morning. The war had been over, in various official senses, for more than 2 years. It ended anyway. The records generated by the war filled warehouses. Significant portions of them remained classified for decades. Some were destroyed. Some were lost through institutional neglect, misfilings, the ordinary entropy of paper in humidity. The process of declassification was slow and incomplete, and driven more by the passage of time and the work of individual researchers than by any systematic institutional commitment to transparency. The Veterans Administration processed claims. Courts adjudicated disputes over exposure and causation. Families built memorials. Historians wrote books. The men who had fought the war aged, and some of them talked about what they had done and seen, and some of them did not. The country moved on to other wars and described those wars in language that the Vietnam experience had made available, and some of that language was the language of lessons learned, and some of the lessons were accurate, and some of them were not. And the gap between what was known and what was said about those wars was smaller than it had been in Vietnam, or larger, depending on which reports you read and which ones you were permitted to read. The last American soldier to leave Vietnam under the terms of the Paris Peace Accords departed on March 29, 1973. By that date, the military advisory mission that would continue under other authorizations had already been planned. The war that had officially ended continued in the form of funding, weapons shipments, intelligence sharing, and the work of advisors whose presence was authorized under agreements that used different language than the agreements that had just expired. The distinction between the war that had ended and the assistance that continued was a legal distinction that the people on the ground, on both sides of it, did not always find meaningful.